Hey guys, and welcome back. So in the previous nugget we had talked about the boot process with respect to our Linux system, and we happened to mention the concept of bootloaders. Now I did say we had two different bootloaders. There actually are more, we'll get to look at some more a little bit later on, but the main ones we want to focus in on are Grub, and then after this nugget right here we'll talk about Grub 2, which was the replacement. But for now, let's begin with Grub itself. So Grub, like I say, otherwise known as Legacy Grub, since it has been ultimately replaced. This stands for the Grand Unified Bootloader, GRUB. Now, the Grub bootloader ultimately replaced older systems such as Lilo, which we will talk about very shortly. But eventually, as good as Grub was, and as much of an improvement over Lilo that it was, it did eventually run into some limitations. So as such, you really are not going to see the original Grub in use very much anymore. And the reality is, we just have to understand this information for both historical purposes and really for the purposes of the examination, because this is still a subject whereby you may receive questions on. Now, with respect to Legacy Grub, what we want to understand are some key components. The first thing which I want to talk to you about is the Grub Legacy configuration file. Now, this is going to be at a particular location, and that location is going to be in the boot directory, and then within this, the Grub directory, and then the file will be called grub.conf, so really try to remember the name of this file here. Now, like I say, because we have the updated version of Grub, Grub 2, now it really isn't quite so easy to be able to get your hands on an old configuration file, but for the purposes of letting you see what one may look like, I have created my own right here. So this is not a complete configuration file. Most of the information has actually been removed, but what you actually want to know for the purposes of the examination, I have included. So when we look at this configuration file, we have some particular settings. We can see these on the left here, things like the default setting or the timeout setting or the splash menu or the hidden menu, so on and so forth. We want to understand what these settings actually are and what they're doing. Now, with respect to the very first setting, the default setting, let's talk about that for a moment. So let me show you what I mean when I say this. So all I'll do here is search for Grub menu, and you can kind of get an idea what I'm talking about here. So we can see this little menu here, okay? Now the one at the very top here, this is the operating system with the particular kernel we're going to be loading into. Now what we're looking at here are all these different titles, okay? Now if you don't actually change the title, i.e. what we have selected, to maybe be another option, say for example this one here, and you can do this by using your arrow keys to arrow down to the option you want to choose. If a particular title is not selected before a particular timeout value has exhausted itself, the one that is going to be selected is the one at the very top. Now this is going to be assigned a value of 0, whereas the second title, the one below, that would be assigned the value 1. So if we happen to change this value here to maybe be the value 1, if we go back and we look at the menu option here, the one which would load if we do not select anything by the time the timer exhausts itself will be option number 1. So the very first one would be 0, the next one would be 1, the next one would be 2, so on and so forth. So if we set the value to 1 as the default, that means if we don't select anything, it's going to be this one here that is going to automatically load. You see that? That will be our default option. And like I say, to start off with, the default is going to be 0, which will be the very top one right here. So we can toggle that value. Now we just happen to mention the concept of a timeout. Whenever a timer runs out, we will select by default a particular option. Now the value of how long we want to wait can be denoted right here. So what we have right here in my little example here is the value of 5. This denotes 5 seconds. That means that once we begin to load up, we're going to have 5 seconds to choose a particular option. And if we do not choose anything, by default, we will choose value number 1. So all this timeout here is ultimately a countdown, and it's a countdown in seconds. So you could If you so choose, extend this to be much longer, say for example 30 seconds, or you could put it down to 1 second if you want. This is ultimately up to you. So now we move to our next option, the splash menu. All this is the graphic displayed when you're going to see that Grub boot menu we just saw there. Now what we're looking at right here happens to be a particular image, and it's going to require this particular extension, xpm.gz. With xpm actually denoting the graphic format, and gz, you may recall, just means it is a compressed image. Now, we also have this option here for a hidden menu. One thing to note here is that this menu doesn't actually have a correlating value. You see the way before we had this equal sign here and equals here and equals here to give each option a particular value. In the case of default, the value is 1. In the case of timeout, the value is 5, so on and so forth. With hidden menu, we do not have any equal sign. We do not have a value to correlate. Simply put, if this option here happens to be present within the configuration file, which in my case right here it is, the Grub menu is not going to be displayed. Instead, the only thing you're going to see is that countdown timer. So that means that if you happen to press a key on the keyboard before the timeout actually ends, then you will actually see the graphic menu. But otherwise, it's going to be hidden away from view. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is this portion right here. And this really is, I would say, more of an important portion to focus in on, because whilst the top part is still quite important, it's ultimately window dressing, so to speak. Whereas this part here is definitely not. The title, okay, so what is this part right here? So the title is basically what is going to be the name that is going to be displayed in the Grub menu when the actual boot process happens. Now, typically you want to display the name of the distribution as well as the kernel version for that distribution. So if we happen to go again and look at the example from the boot menu, we can see here we have Ubuntu on the left here, which is the distro, and we can see the Linux kernel version that it's going to be using in this case here. You kind of get the drift. We want to be pretty descriptive about what it is that is actually going to be loaded up. So really what we see here is Ubuntu with Linux 380-35 generic. With this configuration file, what you would see in the menu is CentOS and then 2717. Now it's important to note that you do not have to specify this particular format. It just is kind of deemed good practice because it is pretty descriptive. Now the next thing we want to talk about is this setting right here, the root setting, okay? Now what this is going to do, this is going to point to the device that actually has the boot files. So that would mean the kernel file and the init.rd file. Now you might be noticing that below, these are two settings we're going to see here. This is exactly what we're talking about, but with respect to this part right here, all we are doing is trying to locate whereabouts on the disk we can find such things. Now, one thing here which is worth a note, we see this value here, HD00, okay? Now the thing to note straight away is that with respect to Grub, we have no distinction between IDE devices and SATA devices. So you may recall from the LPIC 1, we saw things such as maybe HDA, which would be our IDE, and we would also have SDA, which would be our SATA disks. Notice here we're actually making no such distinction. We actually can't tell if this is IDE or SATA, it's just HD00. Now, the part which is pretty confusing, and this is what actually is going to be a little bit different. So when we see HD00, what this is actually pointing to is SDA1, or if you wish, HDA1. But the point I'm making here is that this value here denotes the very first disk, and this value here denotes the very first partition. So what I'm saying here is that if we see the value 0, it actually means the first partition, whereas we typically would be looking at something like, say, SDA1, and the value 1 would mean the first partition, not in this case here. What we're seeing here is that the value 0 actually correlates to the first partition, as well as the first disk. So if we happen to have the value HD and then 01, for example, well, we would know this would be on the first disk, so that would be something like, say, SDA A being the first disk, and the 1 would actually be the second partition, which would be number 2 right here. So this part sometimes catches people out because we are starting from the 0 value and not the value 1. So ultimately this is where we're going to be able to find our kernel image and our init.rd image, i.e. what disk in what partition, but the name of the kernel image we want to be using is going to be specified at this part here using the kernel keyword. So the actual kernel we would be using would be in the boot directory, and it would be called this right here, in my case VM Linux 2717. RO would mean read only. And then what we have to do, and this part really is crucial, we have to specify where we're going to mount the root file system. Now these two values we're going to see afterwards, these actually relate to Red Hat based systems. What RHGB actually stands for is the Red Hat Graphical Boot. This is just simply a graphical user interface that is going to boot with most of the information hidden. And this is what we're doing when we specify this quiet option. We want to hide the majority of the boot messages. Now, that is the kernel location. The init.rd, again, going to be within the boot directory on the first disk of the first partition of the hard drive. And the name of the init.rd image is going to be, in this case here, init.rd 2717 image. Now, one thing we want to be aware of is that our init.rd is going to reference a particular kernel number, which we can see here, and we absolutely want to make sure that that number matches what the kernel is we have here. If we have a mismatch here, then we're going to be in trouble. We're not going to be able to get things to work correctly. So that really is us for our little introduction into Grub Legacy. Like I say, we are kind of limited as to what we can actually do because this is a legacy-based system. But what we have learned here is actually quite transferable to what we're going to see with respect to Grub 2. And that is what we're going to be looking at in the very next nuggets. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.